Out there in the endless blue stretch of the Pacific during World War II, a place where giant warships collided beneath the blazing tropical sun and the destinies of nations teetered on the edge, one humble destroyer escort managed to pull off something no other ship in naval history has done before or since. This is the remarkable story of the USS England, a small but determined vessel that, over the course of just 12 relentless days, sent 6 enemy submarines to the ocean floor. It set a record so astounding that it still stands unchallenged today. Between May 19th and May 31st, 1944, this single American warship methodically tracked down and destroyed an entire chain of Japanese subs. In doing so, it didn't just alter the course of the naval war. It proved how deadly effective the Navy's new anti-submarine technology could be. But the tale of the USS England isn't just about fancy technology or brilliant tactics. It's also a powerful story of human courage, sharp intelligence, and ingenuity forged under some of the toughest conditions imaginable. Interestingly, it doesn't begin with roaring guns or dramatic explosions at sea. Instead, it starts quietly, with a group of American codebreakers working in a plain, unremarkable building tucked away in Pearl Harbor. On May 13, 1944, the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, better known as FARUPAC, the successor to Commander Joseph Rochefort's legendary Station Hypo, intercepted what looked like a routine Japanese transmission. The message came from the submarine ID-16, reporting to the commander of Japan's Submarine Division 7. On the surface, it seemed to contain nothing more than routine details. An expected arrival time near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, set for 2200 hours on May 22nd. But to the sharp minds of U.S. intelligence officers, that simple message meant something far more significant. It was an opportunity to strike directly at the heart of Japan's undersea fleet. The intelligence work that made the USS England's success possible had been years in the making. Since the early days of the war, American cryptanalysts, mathematicians, linguists, and expert puzzle solvers had been toiling away in secret, trying to crack Japanese naval codes. Their work, done in windowless rooms packed with IBM tabulating machines and mountains of paper, had already helped secure victories at Midway and in the Solomons. But never before had this kind of decoded intelligence been used so directly or so effectively in submarine warfare. Breaking Japan's JN-25 naval code demanded not only mathematical skill but also a deep understanding of Japanese language and culture. Every message had to be caught, logged, studied for recurring patterns, and then slowly unraveled through a combination of machine calculation and good old-fashioned human intuition. Once decoded, this critical information was immediately sent through secure lines to the U.S. Third Fleet, and then to Commander Hamilton Haines, who led Escort Division 39 stationed at Tulagi in the Solomons. Haines was a battle-tested destroyer commander who'd already seen plenty of action in the Atlantic before being reassigned to the Pacific. His hard-earned experience hunting German U-boats would soon prove invaluable. He didn't waste a second. Haines quickly pulled together a 3-ship hunter-killer team, choosing the finest anti-submarine vessels available for the mission. The task group included 3 Buckley-class destroyer escorts, USS George, DE-697, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Fred W. Just, USS Raby, DE-698, under Lieutenant Commander James Scott, and USS England, DE-635, led by Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton. The England was temporarily detached from Escort Division 40 at Purvis Bay on Florida Island to join the operation. On May 18, 1944, all 3 ships departed Purvis Bay, with Commander Haines aboard the George acting as the officer in tactical command. These particular ships weren't chosen by chance. Each was specifically equipped and trained for anti-submarine warfare, and their crews had spent months sharpening their skills in the perilous waters of the Solomons. They'd already worked side by side, fine-tuning their coordination and communication, teamwork that would soon make all the difference. Although most of the sailors were young and hadn't seen much combat, they were exceptionally well drilled. They'd practiced sonar operations, attack formations, and emergency procedures until it all became second nature. That tireless preparation was about to pay off in a way none of them could have imagined. That relentless training the crews went through would soon pay off in ways no one could have possibly imagined. But the mission to hunt submarines wasn't just an isolated operation. It was part of a much bigger chess game playing out across the vast Pacific. The same day our task force set sail, new radio intelligence came in, and what it revealed sent a chill through the chain of command. The Japanese Navy had begun setting up a scouting line, 7 submarines in total, known as the NA line. It stretched in a long defensive arc between the Admiralty Islands, north of New Guinea, and Truk in the Caroline Islands. This picket line sat directly across the route our carrier groups were expected to take during their next big offensive. The Japanese High Command knew another Allied landing was coming. They just didn't know where. Was the target going to be the Marianas, the Western Caroline Islands, or maybe the western tip of New Guinea? They were guessing, but they were determined to be ready. By the middle of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in a desperate spot. Their once mighty carrier force was a shadow of its former self, and their scattered island bases were being cut off one by one. Submarines had become one of their last remaining tools, useful not only for gathering intelligence, but also for trying to disrupt our operations at sea. The NA line was designed to serve as an early warning net, a way to give the Japanese fleet a heads up if American ships were on the move. Each sub was assigned a precise patrol sector in order to stay put, report any sightings, and not deviate from its area. That strict discipline might have looked good on paper, but it was exactly the kind of rigidity that would end up dooming them. Unlike the Americans, who gave our sub-commanders freedom to roam and adapt, the Japanese system left no room for improvisation. Japanese strategists, studying our recent carrier strikes that had supported General Douglas MacArthur's westward push along the northern coast of New Guinea, came to the conclusion that Western New Guinea was probably our next objective. Acting on that assumption, the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Somu Toyoda, launched Operation Eigo, a plan for what they hoped would be the decisive naval battle to stop our advance once and for all. The operation's purpose was to protect Japan's so-called inner defense perimeter, which stretched across the Marianas, the Western Carolines, and the western approaches to New Guinea. But instead of saving the empire, the execution of that plan would lead straight to one of the worst defeats in Japanese naval history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. History would remember it by another name, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. In June of 1944, Japan would lose 3 aircraft carriers and hundreds of veteran pilots and planes, losses they could never hope to replace. Operation Eigo also exposed just how fragile Japan's naval power had become by that point in the war. The brilliant pilots they'd lost at Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz had never been fully replaced. The new flyers coming out of their crash course training programs simply didn't have the skill or experience of the men who came before them. Meanwhile, the United States had turned pilot training into a full-blown industrial effort, cranking out thousands of highly trained aviators with top-notch equipment. The technology gap was widening, too. Our F-6F Hellcat fighters could outfly and outfight just about anything the Japanese put in the air, and our ships bristled with radar-guided anti-aircraft guns that made attacking them nearly suicidal. To support Operation Eigo, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, commander of Japan's 6th Fleet submarines, ordered the 7th Submarine Squadron to set up the NA scouting line. Takagi was an experienced undersea commander who had seen firsthand the steady decline of Japan's once proud submarine fleet. At the beginning of the war, Japan's submarine fleet was among the best on the planet, expertly built, crewed by highly trained sailors, and armed with some of the most advanced torpedoes in existence. But by 1944, those days were long gone. The losses had been brutal, and the new crews being rushed into service simply couldn't match the skill or experience of the veterans who came before them. Worse yet, the Japanese Navy's submarine doctrine had been flawed from the start. They focused on attacking warships instead of targeting supply vessels, a decision that proved disastrous. While our submarines were cutting off Japan's lifelines and choking their economy, their subs were being hunted down and destroyed, often with little to show for the sacrifice. In what would turn out to be a fatal mistake, 7 Japanese submarines were assigned to fixed positions along that NA line, locked into specific coordinates instead of being allowed to roam freely as our own submarines were. That rigid structure would soon become their undoing. The chain of events that sealed their fate began when Japanese forces intercepted an American aircraft's contact report about one of their own subs, RO-104. In a quick response, Japanese command sent out an urgent radio message to all the subs in the NA line, ordering them to shift their patrol zones 60 nautical miles to the southeast. Each sub was given its new coordinates. What they didn't know was that this routine transmission was immediately picked up by American radio intelligence. The intercept was forwarded to the Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Area, JICPOA, where teams of cryptanalysts got to work breaking it down. It was an incredibly complex process, not just decoding the message, but also understanding the Japanese coordinate grid system and how their Navy formatted operational reports. After hours of careful analysis, the codebreakers succeeded. They pulled the exact positions of every submarine in the NA line straight out of that message. For the first time in the Pacific War, this kind of top-secret ultra-intelligence was cleared and shared directly with frontline anti-submarine forces. It was an unprecedented move, and it gave us a massive edge. Even more impressive, the intelligence proved astonishingly accurate. Time and again, when our ships reached the designated areas, the enemy subs were right there, usually within 50 nautical miles of the predicted position, sometimes even closer. Of course, there was a major risk in using that intel so directly. If the Japanese ever figured out that we had cracked their codes, they'd change them instantly, and that would wipe out one of our greatest advantages in the war. So the Navy took extreme precautions to hide the source. Elaborate cover stories were prepared to make every successful contact seem like a lucky break, or the result of a routine air patrol. Even the crews on our ships weren't told the truth. We were told that aircraft had sighted enemy submarines, and we were simply responding to those reports. None of us knew at the time that we were acting on information pulled from one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The 3 destroyer escorts in our hunter-killer group were all brand-new Buckley-class vessels, part of the massive shipbuilding surge that had America turning out hundreds of warships at an almost unbelievable pace. In total, 154 Buckleys were planned, with 148 actually completed. A few even ended up serving with the Royal Navy under the Lend-Lease program. The Buckleys were designed to strike a balance, powerful enough to hunt submarines effectively, but simple and affordable enough to build fast in commercial shipyards, often by workers who had never built a warship before. They weren't as large or as fast as the big fleet destroyers, but they made up for it with specialized sonar systems, depth charges, and advanced anti-submarine weapons. Their diesel-electric engines didn't give them blazing speed, but they could stay at sea for a long time without refueling, perfect for the kind of long hunts we were about to undertake. Each ship carried a name meant to honor an American serviceman who had given his life in battle. It was a tradition that meant something deep to all of us. We knew the names painted on our hulls weren't just symbols. They represented real men, real heroes. That knowledge carried weight. It reminded us of the price that had already been paid and the duty we had to live up to it. Take the USS George, for example. She was named after Seaman Second Class Eugene F. George, who was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions as an anti-aircraft gunner aboard the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco during the savage naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 12, 1942. That battle was one of the bloodiest surface fights of the entire war. Close-quarters combat at night, ships trading fire almost point-blank, guided only by flashes of gunfire and fleeting shadows. During the chaos, a Japanese G-4M Betty bomber, already burning from the San Francisco's anti-aircraft fire, made a suicide dive straight toward the cruiser's gun deck. George and his gun crew didn't flinch. They kept firing right up until the moment of impact. The bomber slammed into the San Francisco's bridge, killing Admiral Daniel Callahan and most of his staff. But George and his fellow gunners had stood their ground to the very end. George and his gun crew never broke. They stood firm at their posts, firing until the bitter end. For their bravery, George and several of the San Francisco's gunners who gave their lives that night were posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. And, in their honor, new ships would carry their names into future battles. The USS Raby was one of them, named after Rear Admiral James Joseph Raby, a man who'd already earned his Navy Cross during World War I. Back then, he commanded transatlantic convoys, including the very first one to cross the Atlantic under American escort. Admiral Raby was one of the pioneers of anti-submarine warfare. Many of the tactics he developed decades earlier were still in use when we went to sea. His work proved something that shaped naval strategy forever. When convoys were properly protected, even the deadliest submarines could be defeated. Sadly, Admiral Raby's life was cut short. He was killed in a car accident in 1934 while serving as the commandant of the Charleston Naval District. But his legacy, protecting convoys and saving sailors, lived on through the ship that bore his name. Then there was the USS England, and her story carried the most emotional weight of them all. She was named for Ensign John Charles England, a young naval officer who died during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. England was just 4 days shy of his 21st birthday. That morning, he'd volunteered to take a radio room shift aboard the USS Oklahoma, trading duties with a friend so the other man could have more time with his visiting family. England himself was waiting for his wife and their newborn daughter, a baby girl he had never met. They were supposed to arrive in Hawaii within days. When the first Japanese torpedoes struck the Oklahoma and the battleship began to roll over, England managed to escape to the deck. What he saw there was chaos beyond words. Fire, oil, men shouting and slipping into the burning water as planes strafed the survivors. The ship was turning turtle, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Then, in an act of sheer courage, England went back below. He remembered his fellow radio men still trapped in the compartment below deck. 3 times he descended into the flooding, pitch-black interior, each time guiding a sailor to safety through narrow, tilted passages that were quickly filling with water and oil. The power had failed, and he had to find his way by touch, navigating through the dark by memory alone. On his 4th trip down, he never came back. Ensign England was one of 429 men who went down with the Oklahoma that day. The tragedy of that ship was one of the worst moments of Pearl Harbor. As she rolled completely over, hundreds of men were trapped in air pockets deep inside her hull. For days afterward, rescuers could hear desperate tapping from within, sailors trying to signal that they were still alive. Crews worked around the clock to cut through the ship's steel skin. They managed to pull 32 men to safety, but for most, including England, help came too late. He was buried among the unknown dead at the Punch Bowl National Cemetery in Hawaii. For decades, no one could say exactly where his remains were. But in 2016, thanks to advances in DNA technology, his body was finally identified. 75 years after his death, Ensign England was brought home to Colorado Springs and laid to rest beside his parents. He received only a Purple Heart during the war, but his incredible heroism, willingly going back into a sinking ship again and again to save others, lived on in a different way. Not 1, but 2 Navy ships would carry his name, the USS England, DE-635, our destroyer escort, and later the guided missile cruiser USS England, CG-22. The Buckley-class destroyer escorts, ships like ours, were purpose-built to hunt submarines. They carried 3 3-inch guns, enough for defense against planes or small surface threats, but their real power wasn't in their guns. It was in the anti-submarine arsenal they packed. Each ship had a triple bank of 21-inch torpedo tubes, a pair of stern-mounted depth charge racks, 8 K-gun launchers that could hurl depth charges to either side, and, most importantly, a Mark X Hedgehog mortar. That weapon would soon prove decisive. These ships were built from lessons learned the hard way in the Battle of the Atlantic, when German U-boats came dangerously close to starving Britain into submission. The Allies eventually learned that beating submarines required more than just firepower. It took specialized ships designed for that one purpose. The Buckleys were the answer. They were built for long-range convoy escort duty, designed to handle rough seas, and equipped with the latest sonar and radar systems to track subs beneath the waves. Everything about them, from their propulsion to their weapons, was optimized for the hunt. And unlike the big fleet destroyers, these ships could be mass-produced quickly in American shipyards, built by men and women who'd never constructed a warship before, but who learned fast because the stakes were so high. The Hedgehog, though, that was the real revolution. It fixed problems that had plagued sub-hunters since World War I. Developed in Britain in 1941, during the darkest days of the U-boat war, it became widely used by the U.S. Navy just a couple of years later, in late 1943. Instead of dropping explosives behind the ship, the Hedgehog fired 24 small contact bombs ahead of the bow in a tight, elliptical pattern, about 200 to 300 yards forward. Each projectile carried about 35 pounds of high explosive, enough to punch a fatal hole in a submarine's hull. The rounds all hit the water almost simultaneously, forming a deadly net roughly 140 feet wide and 120 feet long. The name Hedgehog came from how it looked when it was loaded. The launcher's protruding spigots resembled the sharp spines of a hedgehog's back. And in the hands of a trained crew, that little beast would soon prove to be the most effective submarine-killing weapon of the war. The Hedgehog truly changed the game when it came to anti-submarine warfare. It fixed problems that had frustrated navies since World War I. Developed by Britain's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development in 1941, and first used the following year, the Hedgehog didn't reach American ships in large numbers until late 1943. It had been born out of desperation, created during Britain's darkest days, when German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. The Allies needed something new, something that could turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Hedgehog was that answer. The weapon was ingenious in its simplicity. It fired 24 small explosives arranged in 6 neat rows of 4, all mounted on a swiveling platform that could be aimed from the deck of a destroyer escort. When fired, it threw its deadly pattern 200 to 300 yards ahead of the ship, not behind it like a depth charge, but right where the target was heading. Each projectile weighed about 65 pounds, carrying roughly 35 pounds of TNT or Torpex, a powerful explosive mix. The entire salvo was timed to land almost simultaneously, splashing into the water in a tight elliptical spread, about 140 feet by 120 feet across. Its odd name came from its appearance. When the weapon was loaded, the launcher's rows of short steel rods looked like the quills on a hedgehog's back. But there was nothing small or cute about its effect. The Hedgehog changed how ships hunted submarines. It solved problems that had haunted naval tacticians for decades. The real secret was in its contact-fused warheads. Traditional depth charges exploded at preset depths, whether they actually hit a submarine or not. The Hedgehog was smarter. Its projectiles only went off if they struck something solid. That one design change gave ships 3 major advantages, and they'd prove vital in the battles to come. First, you knew instantly whether you'd scored a hit. If you heard explosions, the sub was done for. If not, the sea stayed silent. Before the Hedgehog, commanders had to wait 20 minutes or more after dropping depth charges, scanning the surface for oil slicks or debris to guess if they'd succeeded. Now, they knew in seconds. And because it could be reloaded in just about 3 minutes, crews could quickly fire another salvo if they missed. That was critical, since submarines that survived a first depth charge run often slipped away during the long reload times those older weapons required. Second, the Hedgehog fixed another serious flaw that plagued anti-submarine tactics: sonar blindness. Depth charges exploded with massive underwater blasts that deafened a ship's sonar systems for up to 15 minutes afterward. During that time, The sea was a mess of sound waves, turbulence, and bubbles, completely jamming sonar. That gave submarines the perfect window to vanish. With the Hedgehog, it was different. If the shots missed, there were no explosions, which meant the sonar stayed clear. The crew could keep tracking the sub continuously and set up another attack almost immediately. Finally, there was the psychological factor. Depth charges were brutal, loud, and terrifying. They shook submarines to their core and could rattle even the toughest crews. But the Hedgehog was a quiet predator. Submarine captains had no idea they were under attack until the projectiles were already in the water. And by then, it was too late. Those rounds sank about 200 feet in roughly 7 seconds, fast enough that by the time a sonar operator heard the faint thunk of the launch, the explosives were already closing in. It was a silent, surgical weapon, one that took away a submarine's last advantage: surprise. In the days before the Hedgehog, experienced submarine skippers had a pretty good chance of slipping away from an attack. When depth charges were dropped off a ship's stern, a clever U-boat commander could figure out exactly when he was passing through the attacker's blind spot. That small window when sonar lost contact right before the depth charges rolled off the back of the ship. That's when he'd make his move. A sudden dive, a sharp turn, anything to throw off the pattern. Some of those submarine captains were so skilled they could practically count down the seconds until the charges went off, then time their evasive maneuvers to escape the worst of the blasts. The Hedgehog changed all of that. It took away the submarine's one reliable trick. The weapon struck fast and silently from ahead of the target. No warning, no time to react. The ocean was full of unseen death, and even the best commanders couldn't outthink a weapon they didn't know was already on its way. After the war, the statistics spoke volumes. British naval analysts found that during World War II, it took an average of 60 traditional depth charge attacks to sink a single submarine. Early in the war, that number was sometimes closer to 100 attacks per kill. But once the Hedgehog entered service, the odds flipped completely. On average, one submarine was sunk for every 5 or 6 Hedgehog attacks, a 10-fold improvement in effectiveness. That kind of success didn't come from raw explosive power. In fact, each Hedgehog round carried less explosive material than a standard depth charge. But the difference was precision. A single direct hit, even from one projectile, was usually enough to punch clean through a submarine's pressure hull and send it straight to the bottom. The explosion happened right on the steel skin of the sub, focusing the blast inward instead of wasting its energy in open water. The first target of this new weapon, and the reason our hunt even began, was the I-16, one of Japan's most seasoned submarines. She wasn't just another enemy vessel. She had a long and storied history. The I-16 was a Type C-1 submarine, one of the largest and most advanced in the Imperial Japanese Navy. She stretched 358 feet long and weighed more than 3,500 tons when submerged. But what made her truly unique was the small two-man Type A midget submarine she carried on her deck, a secret weapon Japan believed could change the course of naval warfare. The I-16 had already carved her name into history. On December 7, 1941, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, she had launched the very first submarine assault of the Pacific War. Japan's plan for those midget subs was ambitious and, in hindsight, tragically overconfident. Built in secrecy, they were designed to sneak into enemy harbors and unleash torpedo attacks at point-blank range. It was an idea born of daring and desperation, but it was also doomed by the limits of the technology. 5 large mother submarines, including the I-16, carried these tiny craft to Pearl Harbor under the cover of darkness. In the early morning hours, around 12:42 a.m., well before the air raid began, Lieutenant, for junior grade, Masaharu Yokoyama, commanding I-16's midget sub, launched into the black water with orders to infiltrate the harbor and strike at the heart of the American fleet. What happened next remains a mystery. Yokoyama's craft never returned, and his fate was never confirmed. But later that afternoon, the I-16 received a few faint radio signals believed to be from him, claiming success, that his tiny submarine had managed to slip inside Pearl Harbor and attack American ships from within. Those transmissions were the last anyone ever heard from him. The story of I-16 and her midget sub summed up so much about Japan's early war strategy. Bold, inventive, and fearless, but often stretched beyond what their machines and circumstances could actually deliver. Not long after the attack, there was another report early on December 8th, saying one of the submarines couldn't navigate properly. Later analysis after the war showed that none of those submarines had actually managed to hit any American ships during the Pearl Harbor attack. One of them was sunk by the destroyer USS Ward. That was, in fact, the very first exchange of fire in the Pacific War. Another sub met its end inside the harbor, destroyed by the USS Monaghan. One ran aground, and the lone survivor became the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by the United States. The last two simply vanished without a trace. None of the 5 subs launched that day ever made it back to their motherships, and of the 10 men who crewed them, only one survived the entire war, living out his days as a prisoner. About 6 months later, on May 30th, 1942, the submarine I-16 finally accomplished what it couldn't pull off at Pearl Harbor: a successful attack. Operating in the Indian Ocean near Diego Suarez, Madagascar, I-16 launched another mini-submarine commanded by Ensign Iwasa Katsusuke. That sub managed to sneak right into the British harbor and fire its torpedoes, striking the battleship HMS Ramillies and causing serious damage. The Ramillies was a veteran from World War I, weighing in at about 150 tons. She took on nearly 800 tons of water and came dangerously close to sinking. But thanks to quick and effective damage control, the ship survived. She even went on to take part in D-Day, bombarding German positions along the coast. Still, that attack proved something. I-16 was capable of pulling off devastating surprise assaults. Before the mission was over, the submarine also managed to sink the British tanker British Loyalty, but she was lost soon after, along with her crew. That brief success at Madagascar was the high point for Japan's submarine operations. It showed that the strategy could work under the right conditions, but it also made clear just how dangerous and nearly suicidal those missions really were. During the Guadalcanal campaign, I-16 was constantly in action, running supply runs to cut off Japanese garrisons and launching more attacks. By that point, she was part of what became known as the Tokyo Express, Japan's desperate effort to keep its soldiers supplied in the Solomon Islands by submarine, after surface ships could no longer make the trip safely. On November 28, 1942, I-16 launched another mini-sub, H-10, which successfully torpedoed the American cargo ship USS Alchiba. The hit forced the Alchiba to beach herself to avoid sinking. She was carrying aviation fuel and ammunition, and she burned for days before crews were finally able to salvage her. In early 1943, I-16 helped cover the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal, and later continued making supply runs to isolated garrisons in New Guinea. In December 1943, she survived an air attack that caused only minor damage, but her luck wouldn't hold forever. Those supply missions showed just how far Japan's situation had declined. Submarines that were once proud fleet vessels had been reduced to hauling sacks of rice and medicine to half-starved troops stranded on bypassed islands. Every trip meant dodging swarms of American aircraft and warships, risking everything just to deliver a few tons of supplies to soldiers who, in truth, had no hope left. It was a tragic waste of good submarines and skilled crews, but Japan's strict code of honor demanded that no garrison be left to die without at least an attempt to supply them. Then came May 14, 1944. I-16 set out from Truk Lagoon under Lieutenant Commander Takayuki Yoshitaka, carrying a load of rice packed in 75 rubber bags. The supplies were bound for the starving Japanese troops at Buin on Bougainville. Those soldiers had been cut off since November 1943, completely isolated after American forces bypassed the island. Conditions had turned horrific. Men dying every day from starvation and disease, and even reports of cannibalism spreading through the ranks. But I-16 never stood a chance. Her final radio transmission, sent just after she departed, was intercepted and decoded by American intelligence. By the time anyone aboard realized it, 3 U.S. destroyer escorts were already closing in on her position. We had her predicted position, and on the afternoon of May 19, 1944, an Allied reconnaissance plane, a PBY Catalina flying boat from a Navy patrol squadron, spotted I-16 cruising on the surface just north of Bougainville. That sighting confirmed the intelligence reports that had drawn our hunter-killer group to this patch of ocean. The sub was running on the surface, trying to recharge her batteries and make better time toward her destination. Japanese submarines in those days had notoriously weak batteries and sluggish underwater speeds, which forced them to spend long stretches exposed on the surface. Easy prey for radar and aircraft. As soon as the contact report came in, our 3 destroyer escorts formed up in a tight line abreast formation and began a coordinated sonar sweep. The spacing was just right for maximum sonar coverage, creating what sailors like to call an acoustic net, a trap few submarines ever slipped through. At 13:35 hours, one of our sonar operators aboard the USS England, a young kid from Iowa who, funny enough, had never even seen the ocean before joining the Navy, reported a solid contact. The sharp ping that echoed back told us all we needed to know. There was a submarine down there, roughly 350 yards away. The hunt was on. Down below, I-16's crew immediately kicked into their standard evasion maneuvers. Hard turns, sudden dives, rapid changes in depth and speed, anything to confuse our targeting. These tactics had been honed through bitter experience, and more than a few Japanese subs had escaped certain death by using them. Their commanders were trained to think in 3 dimensions, weaving through the depths like hunted animals, using the ocean itself as cover. Inside that submarine, Lieutenant Commander Takayuki Yoshitaka was fighting for his life, and for the lives of the 106 men under his command. Aboard England, Lieutenant Commander Pendleton ordered our first attack run. It took perfect coordination, sonar operators tracking the target's movement, the plotting team crunching the course and speed, and the Hedgehog crew readying their weapon. But that first salvo missed. I-16 dove deep and broke away just in time. We went in for another run, but again, nothing. The submarine was putting up one hell of a fight, using every trick in the book, releasing decoy bubbles to throw off sonar, changing depth so quickly our readings lagged behind, and twisting so violently that her hull must have been groaning under the strain. On our third attack, one of the Hedgehog projectiles finally scored a hit. The explosion shook the ocean, but the submarine's strong hull held together. Down there, the blast must have been horrific. Men thrown into bulkheads, lights shattering, pipes bursting, but somehow the crew kept control and continued to evade. The Japanese were incredibly well trained when it came to damage control, and this crew proved it. Pendleton wasn't one to give up easily. He circled back for a 4th run, lining up another attack, but that too missed the elusive sub. By now, the chase had dragged on for over an hour. You could feel the tension building on deck. Everyone knew we had her cornered, but landing that killing blow was proving harder than we'd imagined. In the plotting room, officers pored over charts, trying to anticipate I-16's next move, while sonar operators strained to hold contact as she slipped deeper, approaching the thermocline layers, those bands of water where temperature shifts could scatter sonar signals. Then came the 5th attack run. This time, our Hedgehog crew had learned from the sub's earlier maneuvers. They'd noticed a pattern, a habit the sub had of turning to port when diving and sticking to certain depth ranges. So they adjusted their aim accordingly. At 14:35 hours, several projectiles found their mark. A moment later, the ocean erupted in a massive underwater explosion so violent that it lifted England's stern clear out of the water. Men were thrown to the deck, and the entire ship trembled from the blast. The other 2 destroyer escorts, miles away, both heard and felt the explosion. 20 minutes later, the first debris started to surface. Oil slicks, broken wood, bits of cork insulation and rubber rice bags floating among the waves. It was unmistakable evidence that I-16 was gone. Among the wreckage, we saw more personal things: a sailor's cap, pages torn from a Japanese book, a single wooden sandal. Small, haunting reminders that even in victory, there's always a terrible price to pay in human lives. The submarine that had once launched the submarine that had fired the very first shots at Pearl Harbor was gone, taking with it Lieutenant Commander Takayuki Yoshitaka and all 107 officers and men aboard. Every last one of them went down with the ship. They died serving a cause that had already slipped beyond saving, hauling sacks of rice to a garrison that, in the end, would surrender anyway when Japan finally lost the war. Around the same time, another group of submarines, the NA Line, 7 boats in all, departed from Saipan on May 17, 1944, heading for their assigned patrol zones. Their send-off was a solemn affair. Vice Admiral Takagi himself attended the ceremony, giving each commander a few final words of encouragement, urging them to do their sacred duty for the Emperor. Each captain received a small ceremonial cup of sake, along with a white headband marked with bold, patriotic slogans. Everyone present knew the truth. The chances of coming back alive were slim to none. By 1944, American anti-submarine warfare had advanced far beyond anything the Japanese Navy could counter. All 7 submarines in the NA Line were RO-class boats, specifically the type RO-100 series, much smaller than the big I boats like I-16. They displaced only 760 tons and carried just 4 torpedo tubes in the bow, with 8 torpedoes total, plus a 76mm deck gun for surface action. These boats reflected pre-war Japanese naval thinking, craftsmanship over quantity. They were solidly built, but Japan simply couldn't produce enough of them to matter. Meanwhile, the Americans were turning out submarines like clockwork, backed by superior radar, sonar, and industrial muscle. Most RO-100s had Type 22 radar, detectors which could warn them of incoming signals, but they didn't have radar of their own. That made them poor scouts for the reconnaissance missions they'd been assigned. Their task was to find and report the movements of American carrier groups. But without radar, they had no choice but to spend long, dangerous hours on the surface, depending on lookouts and luck. In the end, none of the 20 RO-100 submarines Japan built would survive to see the war's end. The first to fall from the NA Line was RO-106, a sub that had already built quite a reputation. Back on July 18, 1943, during the fierce fighting in the Solomon Islands, RO-106 torpedoed the American tank landing ship ST-342 in Blanche Channel, near New Georgia. The torpedo hit with perfect accuracy, right where the ship's ammunition was stored. The resulting explosion ripped the vessel clean in half. The stern section sank immediately, disappearing beneath the waves, while the bow stayed afloat just long enough to be towed toward shore. Out of the 121 men aboard, all 121 were lost, including the entire mess division, mostly African-American stewards and cooks, and Lieutenant Commander M. Leland Barclay, a well-known artist who had designed some of America's most iconic wartime recruiting posters before volunteering for frontline duty. RO-106 didn't escape unscathed that year. In October 1943, she was severely damaged by airdropped depth charges, but she managed to limp home for repairs and return to service a few months later. Then came the morning of May 22, 1944, a dark, pre-dawn hour just before 4 a.m. Aboard the destroyer escort USS George, a radar operator picked up a contact on his screen. It turned out to be RO-106, running on the surface, charging her batteries under the cover of night, a necessary but dangerous practice. Moments later, George's crew trained a 24-inch searchlight across the water and caught the sub dead in the beam. The light must have been blinding for her bridge crew, whose eyes were adjusted to the dark. RO-106's E-27 radar detector had failed, leaving her completely unaware of the destroyer sneaking up on her. But even caught by surprise, the Japanese crew reacted fast. The officer of the deck shouted for an emergency dive, and within seconds the bridge was cleared. The sub's hatches slammed shut as she slipped beneath the waves. The whole dive took less than 40 seconds, well within. Even though RO-106's crew dove fast by Japanese Navy standards, it wasn't quite fast enough. At 04:15, the USS George launched a Hedgehog attack, but the frantic sub managed to slip away just in time. 10 minutes later, at 04:25, our ship, the USS England, picked her up on sonar as she tried to make her escape. The submarine was zigzagging hard, twisting and diving, doing about 8 knots underwater, desperate to shake us. We lined up for our first Hedgehog run, fired, and missed. But then the Japanese commander made a mistake, one that would cost him everything. RO-106 suddenly reversed course and turned bow on toward us, probably trying to line up a torpedo shot. What he didn't realize was that the Hedgehog didn't drop off the stern like old-style depth charges. It fired forward. By turning head-on, he'd unknowingly put himself right into our kill zone. Our second attack struck true. At least 3 of the projectiles hit home. Inside that sub, the explosions must have been absolute hell. Steel ripping apart, water blasting through ruptured seams, electrical circuits exploding in showers of sparks. The pressure hull buckled, and within seconds, the boat collapsed and plunged straight down. RO-106 was gone, taking all 49 men with her. From the first radar contact to the final explosion, the whole engagement lasted barely 36 minutes. The next day, we were at it again. This time our target was RO-104, commanded by Lieutenant Hisashi Izubuchi. He'd spent most of his earlier patrols up north, in the freezing waters of the North Pacific and the Aleutian Islands, a far cry from the steamy tropics where he now hunted. Those northern patrols were mostly quiet reconnaissance work, sometimes striking at the thin supply line between the US and the Soviet Union. But RO-104 had a remarkable moment in her service record. During the Solomon Islands campaign in late 1943, she pulled off one of the most daring rescues of the war. On November 3, 1943, after the Japanese light cruiser Sendai was sunk in a brutal night battle at Empress Augusta Bay, RO-104 surfaced under cover of darkness to rescue survivors, 75 men in all. It was a dangerous mission. American aircraft were patrolling overhead, and enemy warships prowled the area, but RO-104's crew kept at it. Among the men they saved was Rear Admiral Baron Matsuji Ijuin, the commander of Japan's Destroyer Squadron 3, an officer whose survival the Imperial Navy considered critical. Fast forward to May 23, 1944, just before sunrise. At 06:04 hours, an Allied patrol plane spotted RO-104 on the surface roughly 250 nautical miles northwest of Kavieng, near New Ireland. This time, the submarine's radar detector actually worked, giving just enough warning to dive before we could close in. The lookouts must have spotted the plane at nearly the same moment the alarm sounded, because she slid beneath the surface before any of our ships could fire a shot. Once submerged, her captain used every evasion trick he knew. The USS Rabi was the first to attack, but RO-104 had learned from the fate of her lost sister subs. She maneuvered sharply, dove erratically, and then pulled something new, a burst of acoustic deception. That was a Japanese countermeasure that sent out sharp, tuned sound pulses meant to jam a ship's sonar. It was clever and surprisingly effective. For the next 2 hours, Rabi made 4 Hedgehog attacks, and all of them missed. Then USS George took over. Her crew, determined to score a hit where Rabi had failed, launched 5 Hedgehog runs, one after another. Each time, RO-104 dodged at the last second, twisting and turning beneath the waves like a wounded animal refusing to die. Her captain fought with every ounce of skill and nerve he had, but each maneuver drained his batteries and fouled the air inside the sub with carbon dioxide. They were running out of power, out of time, and out of air. Finally, at 08:19, it was our turn again. The USS England moved in. Our first attack missed, but by now our sonar team had been studying RO-104's movements for over 2 hours. They'd noticed patterns. She always seemed to turn starboard while diving, liked to operate between 200 and 250 feet, and would speed up right before making a major course change. Armed with that data, we lined up for our second attack, this time predicting her exact next move. Between 10 and 12 of our projectiles, our second attack found its mark. The ocean shook from the impact, and moments later came the unmistakable sound every sonar operator knows too well. The horrible screech of metal tearing apart, the booming thud of compartments imploding one after another, and then silence. By 10:45 a.m., bits of wreckage began to surface, confirming what we already suspected. RO-104 was gone, lost with all 58 men aboard. The debris field spread wide across the water. Splintered wooden planks, cork insulation, shreds of clothing, and that familiar rainbow-slick sheen of oil marking a submarine's grave. Floating among it all was a life ring stenciled with Japanese characters, solid proof of another confirmed kill. By then, our group's efficiency was becoming chillingly clear. In just 4 days, our hunter-killer team had sunk 3 Japanese submarines, each one tracked, cornered, and destroyed with precision. But the hunt wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The next day, May 24th, brought another contact and another loss for the Japanese. This time it was RO-116, a relatively new boat on only her second war patrol, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shibuya Kuno. She'd been commissioned barely 6 months earlier, and her crew was still green. Many of them fresh graduates from the submarine school at Cure, young men who joined the Navy dreaming of honor and glory. Instead, they found themselves fighting in a war that was rapidly slipping away from Japan. At 01:20 hours, the USS George picked up a radar contact at an incredible distance, 17,000 yards, almost 10 miles out, roughly 225 nautical miles northwest of Kavieng. It was an unusually long-range detection, helped by perfect weather and atmospheric conditions that carried our radar signals farther than usual. The moment the Japanese crew realized they'd been spotted, RO-116 dove. But even that maneuver looked sluggish, another sign of their inexperience. At 01:15, George's sonar team caught her again, now just 750 yards away, like her doomed sisters. RO-116 began twisting and turning underwater, working the rudder hard, shifting depth violently, and even attempting to jam our sonar with bursts of sound. For a while, it worked. George made several attack runs, but every time the sub managed to slip away at the last second. Then we, aboard the USS England, moved in. Our first 2 Hedgehog runs both had to be aborted when the targeting solution fell apart. The sub was maneuvering unpredictably, but not well enough. You could tell the crew wasn't as polished. Their turns came too slow, their reactions too late, and their patterns started repeating. On our third attack at 02:14, the calculations lined up perfectly. We fired, and at least 3 projectiles struck home. This time, the destruction was swift, but eerily quiet. There were no massive secondary explosions like before, no echoes from detonating torpedoes. It seemed that RO-116's warheads hadn't gone off, either because our hits struck away from her torpedo room or because the safety interlocks had done their job. Whatever the reason, the end came quickly. The submarine simply broke apart and slipped beneath the sea, taking all 56 men with her. 2 days later, May 26, 1944, we found another one. The target was RO-108, commanded by Lieutenant Wari Konishi. This boat wasn't just another small sub. She'd already earned a reputation for danger. Back on October 3, 1943, RO-108 had pulled off a textbook torpedo attack in Huon Gulf, off New Guinea. That night, she detected 3 American destroyers by listening to their sonar pings. Carefully, she maneuvered into the perfect firing position, lined them up as overlapping targets, and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes to maximize her chances of hitting. The USS Smith was the first to spot the incoming torpedo wakes. Her captain ordered emergency speed. The USS Smith reacted instantly. Her captain ordered full rudder and pushed the engines hard, cutting across the incoming torpedo wakes. She managed to dodge them cleanly, but the USS Henley wasn't so lucky. 2 torpedoes slammed into Henley's port side, right amidships near the number 1 fire room. The hits were brutal. The explosions tore through her fuel tanks, unleashed massive flooding, and literally snapped the destroyer's keel. Within moments, her back was broken. Henley split in 2 and went down fast, taking 15 men with her and leaving another 52 wounded. The Smith and USS Reed counterattacked immediately, dropping depth charges in all directions, but RO-108 slipped away, diving deep and running silent while the ocean boiled above her. A couple of months later, on December 17, 1943, her luck nearly ran out. A PBY Catalina patrol bomber caught her on the surface while she was charging batteries. The plane dropped a string of depth charges that exploded close astern, tearing open hull plates and flooding the engine compartments. The sub went down by the stern, struggling to stay afloat. It should have been the end of her. But somehow, through sheer grit and discipline, the crew saved her. Working waist-deep in freezing, oily water, they patched leaks, braced bulkheads, and fought to keep her alive. Against all odds, RO-108 limped back to truck for repairs. A miracle in itself. She was back at sea months later, but fate hadn't forgotten her. At 23:03 hours on May 26, 1944, the destroyer escort USS Raby picked up a radar contact, 15,000 yards out, about 110 nautical miles northeast of Seidler Harbor near Manus Island. Moments later, USS England also confirmed the contact before the sub dove. Once underwater, our sonar team aboard England picked her up at 1,650 yards. RO-108 was running flat out, pushing every bit of her submerged speed to widen the distance before we could strike. Raby was vectored in first. She made her attack run, fired a full Hedgehog pattern, and missed. The submarine had turned inside Raby's approach at just the right moment, an incredibly risky move that took perfect timing and nerves of steel. Then, at 23:23, we made our move. England began her run. This time, there'd be no long chase or second chances. We fired our Hedgehogs. Between 4 and 6 projectiles found their mark. The resulting explosions ripped through the water, so violent that they would have torn RO-108 apart instantly. Her hull, already weakened from her earlier battle damage, couldn't withstand the multiple direct hits. She broke apart and vanished beneath the waves, taking all 53 men down with her. By this point, Japanese naval intelligence was starting to panic. On May 27, 1944, Japan's 6th Fleet intercepted and partially decoded American communications. The messages mentioned several submarines destroyed north of the Admiralty Islands. And, as one Japanese report noted, the tone of the American messages was increasingly jubilant. Japan's radio intelligence service, though nowhere near as capable as the American codebreakers, was still functional enough to piece together what was happening. Warning messages were immediately broadcast to the remaining subs of the NA line, repeated across multiple frequencies to be sure they were received. RO-112 got the message first and cleared the area right away. She managed to survive the chaos, though only for a time. She would eventually be sunk by the USS Batfish off Luzon on February 11, 1945, with all 61 hands lost. RO-109 also received the warning and escaped the hunter-killer group's deadly net. But like her sister ships, she was living on borrowed time. She too would eventually... Would you like me to continue right from here with RO-109's final fate? RO-109 didn't last much longer. She was finally tracked down and sunk by the destroyer transport USS Horace A. Bass off Okinawa on May 7, 1945, with all hands lost. But one submarine from the NA line, RO-105, under Lieutenant Junichi Ino, either never received the warning to withdraw, or, for reasons we'll never know, chose to stay put. Maybe her radio was damaged. Maybe her captain believed it was his duty to hold position, no matter the danger. She'd left Saipan on May 14, 1944, carrying not only her regular crew, but also Captain Ryanosuke Kaito, commander of Submarine Division 51. Having a division commander aboard would have made it nearly impossible for Eno to abandon his assigned post without direct orders. Duty, pride, and hierarchy all but chained him to that patrol area. RO-105 had already seen her share of close calls. On August 12, 1943, she dodged 2 torpedoes fired by the USS Tarpon, surviving by pure reflex. Her lookout spotted the white wakes just in time, and a violent turn saved her life. A month later, she fired her own spread at the light cruiser USS Columbia, but the Americans spotted the attack and escaped. She wasn't just a hunter, though. On several occasions, RO-105 surfaced to rescue downed Japanese aviators. Dangerous work that earned her the gratitude of the Naval Air Service, but each time she risked daylight, aircraft, and detection. After RO-108 went down, our 3 destroyer escorts, England, George, and Raby, were running dangerously low on ammunition, especially our Hedgehog rounds. We headed to Seidler Harbor at Manus Island in the Admiralty Islands, where the crew worked through the night reloading supplies and topping off fuel. Nobody wanted to waste a minute. We knew more enemy subs were still lurking out there, and every hour spent tied to a dock was another hour they could slip away. Or strike first. Once resupplied, we joined a larger hunter-killer task group built around the escort carrier, USS Hoggett Bay. The group included the destroyers USS Hazelwood, USS Heermann, USS Hull, and USS McCord, plus the destroyer escort USS Spangler. With the carrier's aircraft now in play, the hunt took on a new level of precision. Planes could sweep huge areas of ocean, spot periscopes or wakes, and radio surface ships directly onto the target. Then came the night of May 30th, 31st, 1944. Around midnight, Hazelwood's radar picked up a contact. It turned out to be RO-105. The sub immediately dove, and what followed became one of the longest, most intense anti-submarine hunts of the entire war. For hours, RO-105's captain fought with everything he had. He dumped debris to fake damage, pumped out oil to create false slicks, and maneuvered so violently that his sub's hull must have groaned under the strain. He was running out of options but refused to give up. All through the night, one ship after another took turns attacking. Hazelwood dropped depth charges, the blasts sending towers of white water skyward, but none of them finished the job. Each run was adjusted for different depths, trying to box her in, but somehow the Japanese sub slipped through every trap. George made several Hedgehog runs and might have scored 3 hits with 1 salvo, yet the stubborn sub kept moving. Damaged, maybe even bleeding from the seams, RO-105 stayed alive, her crew sealing compartments and fighting to keep her afloat. Japanese submarines were tough, divided into multiple watertight sections that could take punishment and still survive. For a while, at least. As dawn broke on May 31st, Spangler and our ship, England, joined the chase. The sea was calm, tinted pink by sunrise, and an oil slick stretched out where earlier hits had scored. But somehow, RO-105 was still down there, still fighting. Spangler went first, firing a Hedgehog spread that missed when the sub made another wild, last-second turn. By that point, Commander Haynes, still aboard George, got on the radio and sent a message that would later become Navy legend. "Oh, hell, go ahead, England." It was half exasperation, half respect. Everyone knew England's reputation by then. We'd already sunk 5 submarines in less than a week. Our crew had been watching through the night, learning every detail of RO-105's movements. We'd seen her hesitation before each big turn, the way she tended to settle into certain depth bands under pressure. When we finally made our run, every man aboard knew this could be the one. At 0736 hours, we fired. The Hedgehog salvo hit squarely, 6 to 10 projectiles connected. The underwater explosion that followed was massive, even compared to the destruction of I-16. A split second later, RO-105's own torpedoes cooked off, triggering a chain of secondary blasts that rocked the entire area. A towering column of water shot hundreds of feet into the air. The shock waves slammed through the hulls of ships miles away. And just like that, The sea swallowed what was left of RO-105, and with her, Lieutenant Eno, Captain Cato, and all 59 men aboard. RO-105 didn't just sink, she was obliterated. The submarine was literally blown apart, taking Captain Cato, Lieutenant Eno, and all 55 men with her in an instant. The oil slick that spread across the surface went on for miles, mixed with twisted metal, splintered decking, and small, haunting pieces of the crew's belongings. It was a grim sight, a brutal reminder of just how total the destruction could be in modern naval warfare. When the sea finally calmed, the reality set in. In just 12 days, from May 19th to May 31st, 1944, the USS England had sunk 6 Japanese submarines. It was a record unmatched in the entire history of anti-submarine warfare. And what made it even more remarkable was that England wasn't some heavy destroyer or fleet flagship. She was a modest destroyer escort, barely 5 months out of the shipyard and on her very first war patrol. The numbers told the story. Of the 7 submarines assigned to the NA line, 6 had been destroyed, 5 of them by England's Hedgehog attacks alone. Only RO-109 had escaped, and even she would meet her end less than a year later off Okinawa. The impact of England's success went far beyond the tactical victory. When word reached Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations himself, he sent a message that would become a part of Navy tradition. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. It was both a promise and a tribute, not only to the ship and her crew, but to Ensign John C. England, the young officer killed at Pearl Harbor for whom the ship had been named. His courage and sacrifice had inspired every man aboard. The crew of USS England was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of only 3 destroyer escorts in the entire war to earn that honor. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism in action against enemy Japanese submarines in the Pacific War area from May 19th to May 31st, 1944. The USS England's brilliant performance in this vital mission contributed materially to the successful operations of our forces and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Our commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Pendleton, received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the submarine hunting campaign. Still, those of us aboard knew that his executive officer, Lieutenant John A. Williamson, deserved just as much credit. It was Williamson who had drilled us endlessly, day after day, week after week, refining every procedure until the crew could practically run an attack blindfolded. His discipline and quiet determination had kept us sharp through long months of monotonous patrols. Later, when he assumed command of England, his contribution to her success was finally recognized. But the significance of those 12 days in May stretched beyond any citation or medal. Strategically, our victories had a ripple effect far greater than anyone realized at the time. The sudden disappearance of the NA line led Japanese naval intelligence to a deadly misunderstanding. Convinced that so many submarines could only have been destroyed by a major American fleet moving through the area, they concluded that our next target must be the Western Carolines, or Western New Guinea. In truth, our real objective lay elsewhere, the Mariana Islands. But the Japanese never saw it coming. That single misinterpretation by Japanese command had enormous consequences. Admiral Toyota, believing a major American task force was heading elsewhere, delayed and misdirected the execution of Operation Ago, Japan's counteroffensive plan. Fleet units burned precious fuel racing to the wrong positions, and by the time they realized their mistake and turned toward the Marianas, it was already too late. On June 15, 1944, the American invasion of Saipan began, catching the Japanese fleet completely out of position. Just a few days later, on June 19th and 20th, the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted, an engagement that would mark the end of Japan's naval air power for good. American pilots later called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and for good reason. In 2 days of combat, more than 400 Japanese aircraft were shot down, while American losses were minimal. 3 Japanese carriers went to the bottom, and the myth of Japan's aerial supremacy at sea was shattered forever. The fall of the Marianas had even deeper consequences. From those captured islands, B-29 superfortresses could now strike directly at the Japanese home islands. In that moment, Japan's fate was effectively sealed. The U.S. Navy, wanting to protect the secret of its intelligence breakthroughs, tried to keep England's extraordinary success under wraps. But Japanese analysts soon pieced together the truth. Their own intelligence officers correctly concluded that the sudden, precise destruction of the NA line had been made possible through American radio intercepts, code breaking. Internal Japanese reports admitted quietly that their codes had been compromised. Yet, in a fatal act of denial, they still clung to the belief that their main naval encryption system was secure. That misplaced confidence cost them dearly. For the rest of the war, American codebreakers continued reading Japanese communications almost in real time, steering Allied forces to intercept ships, convoys, and submarines long before the enemy knew they were being hunted. Looking back, the story of the USS England isn't just a tale about one ship or a single campaign. It stands as something far larger, a testament to human skill, courage, and determination under impossible odds. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of war, when nations collide and the fate of millions hangs in the balance, ordinary men can rise to extraordinary heights. Through teamwork, grit, and sheer willpower, they can change the course of history. The crew of the USS England did exactly that in May of 1944, and because of what they achieved in those 12 relentless days at sea, their names will forever be remembered, etched into the story of naval warfare and retold whenever courage and duty at sea are spoken of.